Hello, everyone, and welcome to the mission log. My name is Jason Gilbert. We are in a journey where I am reviewing every Star Trek mission ever filmed. I want to ask you, would you consider subscribing to this channel? It would really help me out a lot. Now, I've posted 4 reviews previous to this one, so I invite you to please check those out. Now, today, we're going to be taking a look at an engaging and riveting episode titled The Naked Time. This is Season 1, Episode 4. This episode was written by John D.F. Black, directed by Mark Daniels, and produced by Gene Roddenberry. It was released on September the 29th, 1966. So let's dive into the story. The episode begins with a captain's log as the USS Enterprise enters into orbit around the winter planet Psi 2000. This planet is getting very close to destroying itself. No stardate is given here, but later in the episode, Kirk mentions a stardate of 1704.2. The mission is to pick up a group of scientists and at a safe distance watch the planet destroy itself. Spock and a crewman beam down in 23rd century hazmat suits. They find that everything is frozen and every person they find is dead. Frozen bodies of the scientists that they were supposed to pick up. They notice some strange things about the bodies. The engineer literally sat at his post and allowed himself to freeze to death. They also make mention of a man that was taking a shower fully clothed. As Spock goes to see if there are more bodies, crewman that beamed down with him, his name is Joe, removes one of his gloves to scratch his nose and then neglects to put the glove back on. As he places his bare hand down, a liquid substance moves its way to his hand. Spock comes back and reports that all are dead and that it is nothing like they have ever dealt with before. We then fade to the title sequence. The Enterprise stays in orbit around the planet to watch it destroy itself to thereby complete the mission. Spock and Joe beam aboard and they bring up whatever infected Joe. We see Mr. Scott at the controls, and what a wonderful sight that is. Kirk orders that they go to McCoy for examination. In sickbay, McCoy pokes a little fun at Spock's green blood, and Joe is seen rubbing his arm. He exhibits strong emotions about what he saw down on the planet, and it is here, for the very first time, where we see Nurse Christine Chapel, played by Majel Barrett, and she did a wonderful job. Spock is seen at a conference table with Kirk and the lead team, going over tapes from the planet's surface. Something drove those scientists mad, but it was not drugs or alcohol. Kirk then asks the obvious question if what happened down there could happen on the ship. And it's at that point when Uhura notifies Kirk that there is a magnetic shift taking place on the planet. We then go to the cafeteria area where Joe is starting to act stranger. Sulu and the navigator Riley walk in and sit down with Joe. And when Sulu notices him rubbing his hand, he asks if he's okay, and Joe responds in a very, very angry manner. And he goes on a rant about how their mission in space is wrecking people's lives, and then he holds a knife to Sulu. And then he turns the knife on himself to commit suicide. Sulu and Riley try to stop him, and as they tackle him to the ground, the knife goes into Joe's stomach. As Riley calls for help, he notices something going on with his hand. On the bridge, they are monitoring the planet, and Spock said that the planet was condensing faster than expected. And he mentioned to Captain Kirk that they may be witnessing Earth's distant future because this planet used to be very much like Earth at one time. We then see Sulu and Riley struggling with issues in their hands. In sickbay, McCoy and Chapel are performing surgery on Joe. His injuries were not that severe, and yet he died on the operating table, much to the chagrin of McCoy. He summons Kirk to sickbay. Now on the bridge, Sulu's and Riley's symptoms are worsening, and it's at that point when the virus completely sets in. Sulu leans in and asks Riley to abandon their post and head down to the gym for sparring. Sulu then leaves. McCoy gives his report to Kirk, and while talking, begins exhibiting symptoms of the virus. On the bridge, as the ship begins to head towards the planet's atmosphere, Spock turns and notices Sulu was gone. He rushes over to the helm to correct the ship. Spock asks Riley where Sulu is, and Riley begins acting like a drunk. Spock orders Riley to sickbay and has Uhura take his place on navigation. When Riley arrives at sickbay, he begins hitting on Nurse Chapel and has physical contact with her. She then begins to have symptoms. Then we see Sulu coming off the turbo lift with a fencing sword in his hand, acting like a swashbuckling adventurer. He jumps at two crewmen and chases them away. On the bridge, Spock mentions that the virus is making the crew behave according to the customs of their culture from many centuries earlier. In the meantime, the planet's gravitational pull is affecting the ship. Kirk tries to get to the engine room where he is met by Sulu with his sword. Spock subdues him, and this is the very first time we see the infamous Vulcan nerve pinch, although it is not really a nerve pinch, and then delivers a great line, "Someone take D'Artagnan here to sickbay." Kirk is desperately trying to get to the engine room. The ship is out of control, heading to the planet's atmosphere. Riley has taken control of the engine room and has sealed the doors shut. Meanwhile, the virus is spreading throughout the ship. Scott is trying to break into engineering to regain control of the ship, but in the meantime, he found a way to offer temporary stability, but the ship is still heading into the atmosphere. In sickbay, McCoy and Chapel run tests on Sulu to find out the nature of the virus. McCoy leaves to go to the lab. Spock comes in and Chapel begins to make romantic gestures towards him. She touches his hand and passes the virus on to him. And she said at that point that she was in love with him. And the virus is making him struggle with his emotions. Kirk joins Scott in engineering as they try to break in. They are successful and try to regain control of the ship. Meanwhile, Spock is being overcome by his emotions. Scott discovers that Riley has completely shut the engines off and they will take 30 minutes to restart, and they do not have that kind of time. In sickbay, McCoy has found the antidote. He discovers that it passes through perspiration. He administers it to Sulu and almost immediately begins to recover from the virus. Kirk sees Spock struggling and tries to snap Spock out of it by repeatedly slapping him. As Spock pushes him away, Kirk says that they're going to try to implode the engines to restart them. As Spock considers this, he thinks there may be a way to save the ship by mixing time with antimatter. As Kirk enters the bridge, McCoy gives him the antidote. We see Sulu at the helm, completely healed. Kirk orders a course to get them away from the planet. Spock says they're ready. They begin the procedure to try to break free. There was a loud frequency that affected the crew. The engines imploded and they broke free. But it entered them into a time warp, causing them to move backward in time. Kirk orders Sulu to reverse power and they start moving forward in time. Spock informs Kirk that they indeed moved backwards in time 71 hours. He mentions that it's interesting that they can now go back in time to any era they choose. And Kirk said, we may risk that one time. Kirk orders Sulu to resume course onto their next mission, and the Enterprise sails away. What an episode this was. Aside from the fact that it was a Star Trek story, it stands alone as a great science fiction story. This could have easily been developed into a full-length feature film. Kudos to John D.F. Black for this great story. This had so many incredible elements to it. The element of danger right from the outset of the episode. The enemy here was not flesh and blood, but an unseen enemy, a virus which really strikes close to home considering what our world has gone through the last 2 years and is still going through. It's a race against time and the odds are not in their favor. And although I have seen this episode several times, once again, I was riveted and transfixed to my screen. It was fast-paced, but it did not cut off any sense of quality or story. Although we have yet to meet Mr. Chekhov, we see the rest of the classic lineup, and it was wonderful to see. The characters fuse well together. George Takei shined in this episode. Absolutely brilliant performance. It was nice to see him spotlighted. I could easily go back and watch this again and not be bored. We also get to see several areas of the interior of the Enterprise that we haven't before. It was a beautifully crafted and beautifully shot episode. There are very few things that I did not like about this episode. Some of the acting was a little over the top. I think maybe that's the only criticism I could say. But I will say that even the over-the-top acting added to the fun and to the intrigue of this episode. I give The Naked Time 5 out of 5 Starfleet insignias for awesomeness. It was a fantastic episode. I encourage you to check it out on your own. I think you will love it. Well, that's it for this week's mission log. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please feel free to drop a comment and share what you liked or didn't like about this episode, or even if you think that I'm out to lunch. All I ask is that the comments remain respectful and profanity free. And please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. It would really help me out greatly. I also want to let you know that I will be vacationing with my family for the next 2 weeks. I will try to get a video uploaded for next week, but it might not happen. I hope that you understand. Next time, I will be reviewing the episode The Enemy Within, and I hope that you'll join me once again. Until then, live long and prosper.